Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, brought to you by Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome. It's the latest People Agenda podcast. My name's Chris Howard from Lace Partners, joining you as always for our latest edition of our podcast. And it is a duet today, no co-host with me, sorry. And that's because I wanted to get somebody on to talk about their career specifically and focus in on the guest. And we're focusing in on reward and performance, which of course at Lace Partners is one of the services that we offer organizations. And I'm absolutely delighted to get an experienced HR professional and somebody who has led reward teams across some very large organizations, including HSBC and Standard Chartered. It's Jenny Craik. Jenny, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks, Chris. Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you on. It's great to have you on. It's a funny one, this, because I'm going to let the listeners into a little bit of in behind the curtain a little bit, because I'm in the office recording this, and because we have echoey walls, I have this huge kind of soundproofing device that goes around the microphone, and I'm disappearing behind it. And I think Jenny's probably going to spend half the time thinking I'm being answered questions against a huge block robot type thing, but hopefully we can get through it. I'm really excited to talk about part of your career as part of a series that I think we're going to do a little bit more of, just exploring the different careers of people and senior professionals who have worked within our business. Now, I'm going to get you to talk a little bit about your background first, and then we're going to talk about reward as a profession, and we're going to get into some other bits as well. But before we do that, we have a little tradition on our podcast. I have given you a little pre-warning that you will be asked a fundamentally different question. And so, Jenny, before we get into the whys and wherefores of yourself, let's delve right into that. So today's fundamentally different question, I've just read an article, an oddities article across the Associated Press, that a real possum appeared amongst a plush toy animal section in an Australian airport gift shop. My question to you is, if you could be in that gift shop and find any gift shop around the world and find any kind of plush soft toy turned real live animal that you get to take home with you, what would it be?
Oh, it would definitely be in Africa. And I think I would go for a baby cheetah. Oh. My 4-year-old nephew is currently obsessed with cheetahs, and I actually was looking for a jelly cat, but they don't do one. So that would be what I'd pick.
I love that. And I bet they're really cute and fluffy and lovely. And for the purposes of this game, they never age, because let's face it, around your lovely house, which I can see a little bit of the background in, there is absolutely no chance that you want a full live cheetah running around scratching up all of the furniture, I'll bet.
No, I think all African animals can only be kept as pets as babies.
Yeah, exactly. Because I actually think I was thinking about this as well. A lion. I've got a cat at home. I thought at first a little baby lion, but I don't think the cat would go on with it. And I think my wife would certainly be a bit grumpy with me that I haven't chosen to take home a baby elephant, because she loves elephants. But I'm going to stick with the baby elephant to keep her happy in case she reads this. And then the logistics of trying to get a baby elephant around our house, which is a townhouse across multiple floors, I have to cross that bridge when it actually came to it.
I think so. A baby rhino would also be quite good. Maybe that one could go up and down stairs more easily.
Yes, we definitely need some kind of a lift or a stair lift or something like that to get those babies along. But we're not here to talk about that. We are here to talk about you. Do you want to give our wonderful listeners of this podcast just a little bit of background on yourself and your career? And then we can get into a little bit more about some of the challenges that you faced, what you see the future of reward is, and et cetera, et cetera.
So I've been working in HR for 20 years, mostly in financial services and in international financial services. So I've been lucky enough to work all over the world. As you said, most recently, I was the head of reward and performance and employee relations for HSBC. Before that, I did the same role at Standard Chartered Bank. And then before that, I spent 7 years at Barclays in a variety of different reward jobs, including 4 years living in South Africa, working for the African business as their head of reward in Johannesburg. So that's a little bit about me.
Lovely. And obviously that's where the cheetahs have come from, that experience of South Africa. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how you got into the reward space, because I can imagine this might be a conversation. It's certainly a conversation I know that I've had with payroll professionals, or a lot of people do generalist HR, you do find some people say, I've always liked people. It's something that I wanted to study. And so I got into the HR space. But when you get into the specialist bits areas like payroll or shared services or HR technology, often people say, I didn't originally look at that. So tell us a little bit about your kind of grounding. And I'm assuming you didn't wake up one day as an 11-year-old and say, I want to be a reward and performance specialist.
No, I'd love to know if there is an 11-year-old who's ever said that. I had no idea it was even a job. I didn't really even think I was aware that HR was a possible profession. I did a history degree at university because I followed that sort of advice of do something you really enjoy, which was brilliant until you've graduated and have no idea what to do next. So that sort of gave me analytical skills. It helps you take perspective. It makes you a good critical thinker. But unless you want to become an academic or a teacher, it's not obvious. So I actually came into HR completely by accident. I was doing some temping, and that happened to be in the HR department of Tesco, the supermarket. And I worked for 9 months actually in the young talent team. So when there's a reward versus talent debate in the HR teams I've worked for, I always remind them that I did actually start my life in talent. And then because I had that experience, I got another temping job working at a property company. And there I ended up doing some generalist HR. So I ran payroll, I answered the phone and took queries, but I really started to get into pensions. I just found it intellectually interesting. And that was the sort of beginning of my path into reward. I rotated around, learned a little bit about pay review, but still was mostly doing pensions. And then I joined Barclays just at the start of the financial crisis. And obviously that was a hugely high impact and important time for reward teams. So there was all the new regulation that came in. I think in my first 2 years at Barclays, we had 24 remuneration committee meetings. So it was like a baptism of fire. I learned more in 2 years than maybe some reward professionals get to learn in 10. So by then I was hooked.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question, which is, I've got a few questions I want to ask, like challenges and things like that. But just you talking about that has got me thinking. So when you entered into the reward space, you had a grounding and you had an opportunity. It was probably at the time quite interesting, complicated, difficult. Maybe it is the answer to some of the biggest challenges you faced. And maybe you want to answer that as well. But let's do it as a double parter. So you can answer that bit if you want to, if that was the most challenging part and what are some of the biggest challenges you've seen. But I'm really interested to get your view on people entering into the reward space now, because you obviously learned those skills. And how easy or how difficult do you think it is for people starting off where you started off in the context of the work they're having to do? Lots of talk around the impact of AI, particularly happening on white collar roles there. So 2 questions there. So the first one is around the difficulty of getting into that type of role that you joined Barclays at and the changes. And then also, perhaps we then naturally segue into some of the biggest challenges you faced in your career.
Absolutely. I think the nature of what you do when you start changes very rapidly now. So it's probably not at all the same, but some things are still quite common about how you get started. And that's finding people to learn from. And I think that's as important now as ever, even though there is a huge array of technical and more other tools out there. So you might not be starting by doing loads and loads of market data matching, but it's really important to find somebody who can teach you the basics of that. And the technical basics you can definitely learn more easily now using AI tools. But the thing that you need a person to help you with is that interpersonal side of it. Reward and performance is all about understanding people. As you get more and more senior, you really learn those lessons, some of them the hard way. And you need to watch how somebody else does it. And sometimes you're watching, that's not how I would do it. And I think when I started, we were all in the office all the time. And so you could listen in on someone's phone calls, you could follow them around. So it's a bit different now. I'm a huge proponent of flexible working. I don't think I would ever advocate for needing to spend 5 days a week in an office unless that's what your clients really needed from you. But there are still ways of doing it. And it's making sure you go out of your way to ask really good questions, to be a sponge, to just look and be curious at what other people are doing and how they're doing it. And I think that's the most important way to learn when you get started.
Yeah. And just to segue onto that, I do want to get into the challenges bit. If you were looking for somebody who's just coming into this sort of profession now, so, if you're the next time you're running a big team and you're looking at what kind of new entrants that might work well in your team? Because I was interested in what you said right at the top about you did the history degree and it's the analytical thinking. Are there some key things that you would look for that makes a good reward person?
Absolutely. I think you've got to be a critical thinker. You have got to be able to listen and take perspective. You have got to be relatively analytical and quite disciplined, have good attention to detail. I think from a technical perspective now, it's not the reward world of spreadsheets anymore. You've probably got to have a better understanding of data science, building models. But again, those things I don't think are essential. The technology will do some of those things, but you've got to know how the technology works. You've got to be able to ask it sensible questions, and you've got to be able to apply that critical thinking to, is the answer that this technology is spitting at me, is that the correct answer, or do I need to ask it some more questions and interrogate it? And then people, I'm amazed at how few people who come into HR have studied behavioral science. And I think if you've worked in HR for as long as we have, there's a whole science that's developed in what we do in the time that we've been working. And yet how we do some of the things we do, the processes we run, haven't necessarily caught up with that. I think that's a huge opportunity for our profession generally. The AI will absolutely change how we all work, but I'm an optimist. I don't believe it's going to replace people. But the person who knows how to use AI might replace you if you don't stay ahead. And it makes the importance of those human skills and understanding what it is that makes humans behave the way that they do. And ultimately, with my ER hat on, how they start interacting with technology, that I think is where we'll spend more and more of our time as time goes on.
Yeah, you can train a large language model to be empathetic, but you can't train them to physically sit in the room, look you in the eye, and to support you from that point of view. So definitely agree there. The risk of this turning into a podcast that sounds a little bit like an interview, I want you to talk to me about the challenges. And I don't want to frame this in a way which is, tell me some challenges that you have faced in your career. So you can go in any direction you want, but I'd love to just get some, even if it's just an example of something, just so that people listening in can either empathize with that, oh yes, I've had that challenge and that Jenny dealt with it slightly differently, or it might be something new for a reward manager listening in. But is there an example, see, without naming names, that you've got a particular thing that springs to mind that's been a particular challenge for you?
You remember the challenges more than the easy
Yeah,
things.
it's like the TripAdvisor thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I think through my career, I'd say the challenges have fallen into sort of different categories. So maybe I'll cover those three categories. I think the first is, I always say to my teams when they've made a mistake, we're not curing cancer. This is not life and death. And it's okay to make a mistake as long as you work out that you have and look how to put it right. But the flip side to that is that sometimes we actually are making life and death decisions. It's typically rare in the financial services industry, but it is true. We make decisions about what is and isn't covered in medical insurance. We make decisions about whether to cover exceptional treatments for people. In COVID, we had a huge amount of those types of really very difficult, pressing human questions that were going to have real life consequences for people, and very little time to make those decisions in quite a high pressure environment. So I would say those have singularly been the most challenging decisions I've made in my career, because I do like people. I am interested in people. I take a lot of perspective, and I can't get away when you're making those decisions from understanding that you're going to change somebody's life by the decision that you make. All you can do in that situation is really ground yourself in remembering, I'm here to work for this organization. The very first HR director I ever worked for used to say, our job is to make commercial decisions and then to execute them with care and compassion. And I think 20 years later, I haven't actually come across a better sort of philosophical explanation of what it is that we do. So you have to hold on to that. You have to understand what's the organization's duty of care, what's their definition of fairness. You have to go back through first principles, and also in those types of decisions, take advice and chat it through with other people if you're unsure. Without a doubt, those are the ones that I still think about, and you wonder, did I do the right thing? So there's a whole array of those. The second, and this will be very familiar to anyone who has looked after a remuneration committee, and that's the managing the tension between management and members of the board. particularly the chairman and the remuneration committee chair. And if you're really lucky, you can get the case where the CEO, the CFO, the chairman, and the chair of the remuneration committee all actually have a completely different view. So you're managing four-way tension. That's actually a very difficult position to be in, and sometimes it's actually quite lonely. And I think that's why it's so important when you do these roles to have a network of people who understand what that works and who you can bounce things off. Even if it's confidential, you can do that anonymously. And again, in those situations, you have to come back to, it's my job to work for the organisation. I'm neither team management or team board. I'm here to do what's right for the organisation I'm working for. You go back to their strategy, their values. And then my experience has taught me, sometimes through making mistakes, that the best thing you can do is be transparent with all parties. And I actually would find it very difficult to work in environments where there's not a general commitment to transparency, because those things become so highly politicized and so much more difficult to manage. So you also do just need a bit of resilience and a thick skin and an understanding that sometimes you will be the messenger in the middle of something. The kind of content of our work is so emotive. For us, it's work, but to other people, we're touching the parts of work that are most personal. What you get paid is very rarely, I've learned, about money and pounds and pence. It's about how somebody feels about your value, how you compare yourself, how you value yourself. So these are very high emotive situations, and you've got to be able to go home and shrug it off and get on with life. And then I think the third category is in then being a leader of teams yourself. And every HR professional will also know that it's easier to tell somebody how to do this stuff than it is sometimes to do it for yourself. I think there is incredible power in building diverse teams, and I love having people around me who think in a very different way to me. But then that diversity can be very difficult to manage. It can create a lot of tension. And I would say all the other challenges I've had have been people related, because there's no manual, there's no spreadsheet. And reward people would love it if there was a spreadsheet that they could put all these things into and it would just tell them the answer. But managing people is hard, and you make mistakes, and some days you get it right and you just keep trying, however experienced you are.
Yeah, absolutely spot on. I remember going back even when I first joined Lace, so 6 years ago, and our co-founder, Kathy, now CEO, wrote a blog about line managers don't always make good people managers and vice versa. And there is no manual to it, as you said. I think that's a really interesting few points you picked up there. I certainly think, and I wrote this down, pay and reward is some of the most emotive discussions that you are going to have as an individual. And it goes back to that whole, as we touched on AI, and AI, you can train AI to be empathetic, but it can't sit in the room with you. And when you've got such emotive conversations happening, it's probably one of those areas that involves the most humanness and the least AI interaction around it. So whilst there's lots of talk about you can automate certain parts of HR's role, same with all back office functions, there are parts of marketing, there are parts of IT, there are parts of finance, which can get automated. But then there's the human elements that you need to hold on to, with the humans being able to actually deliver. And certainly, as you talked about, with such an emotive thing such as pay, it's a very important point to go on to. Let's talk a little bit about some of the most rewarding, excuse the pun there, parts of your career. So can you pick up maybe one or two of the bits that just really you found just so valuable in your career and you've enjoyed so much?
And it's possibly similar ground to the challenges, but just taken from the other side. I think, and I know a lot of people would say this when they reflect on what they like about what they do and work. For me, building teams and making teams work, both the teams that I lead, but also the teams that I am a colleague in, I really enjoy that. And I think coaching, when you have your own team, being in a privileged enough position to be able to help and support people to realise their potential and go on to be a lot better than you are. Looking around now where some of the people I've worked with are in their careers, that I think is extremely rewarding. And I'm really grateful that I got to be a little part of their career story myself. And I feel that way about a lot of people who've influenced me. So I think if you answer it of the what would I remember from my deathbed, it's going to be the people and the relationships and the sort of fun and the camaraderie and the enjoyment when you work with people who all enjoy solving the same problem but think about it differently and you get to the right answer. So that's definitely would be number one. I think for me personally, the opportunity to work internationally has been unbelievably rewarding. I've lived and worked in both the UK and also in South Africa, as I said, but I have been lucky enough to have teams that sit all over the world. And I've spent a huge amount of time with those teams on the ground in Asia, in the US, in South America, Latin America. I think the opportunity to work with people who have a completely different way and frame of reference of looking at the world. I'm a very curious person, and I've learned a huge amount about from the opportunity to work with people from all over the world. And then I think the work I've done, that you can see its impact on people in the organization, it is also very rewarding. People's experience at work makes up a huge part of their life, and the way in which we can influence people's experience at work affects them way beyond the office. It affects the people that they live with. It has this ripple effect. And I think as reward professionals, we do some of the things that have such a huge influence and impact on that. So the sort of times I have implemented new parental leave policies, the times I've implemented flexible working policies, changed the way in which performance management's done so that it becomes much more kind of a two-way engaging process. And then seeing the feedback come through the data in employee opinion surveys or focus groups and understanding, okay, that was the thing that actually made a difference. And it's rarely the thing that you think, that kind of a loop of understanding, okay, these are the things that make a difference. That for me has been very rewarding. And I think it's so easy as an HR professional to get a bit stuck in your echo chamber and think you know what the interventions are. And actually, most people who work in the front line of a business, they've got 2 minutes a day to do the stuff that we are spending all our time thinking about. And it's so important to keep that in perspective and to really understand and make sure you've got that feedback loop of how is this thing that I'm designing here, this wonderful toolkit, is it actually going to be useful? Is the person going to use it?
Yeah. And that feedback loop that you speak about enables you to keep that finger on the pulse of the sentiment of the organization, but also it helps with the relationships you build, which actually is a segue into the next question I wanted to ask you, because obviously reward, it's about pay, it's about benefits. And we talked about the emotive side about that as well. But I'm interested to see how you navigate and balance, because as a reward professional, you're sitting between like the demands of the finance team, and we have this amount of money that we can pay our people, versus the demands of the HR team or the people team who are focused on that employee experience, the employee value proposition. So given that you sit in that sort of intersection between the two, how have you found dealing with the balance of that in your career?
I think I'd come back to what quote the HR director again, that commercial decisions and then execute them well with care and compassion. And I think you mentioned finance, the partnership between HR and finance, and I think particularly the partnership between reward and finance, it is so critical if you want to get anything effective done inside an organization. And I think it's something that people struggle with. And some of that's just because you don't spend enough time really thinking, how shall I go about building this relationship? How shall I make that partnership work? I've had some brilliant ones. I've had some not so brilliant ones. If I think about the way I've worked with my finance colleagues in different places at different times. But I think the ones that have been brilliant, they're characterized by a sense of mutual respect and curiosity. It does take both parties to understand this person brings value, and it's not the kind of value or the way I have of thinking about the world. But if we put them together, they can be really effective. Now, it's a bit of a cop-out to say it has to be both, because you can still make an effort. And if you start being curious with your finance colleagues, sometimes that will turn the ship and the rest will follow. So some of the most successful partnerships I've had with finance colleagues, I've spent a huge amount of time saying, really help explain to me how the performance of this business is working, really explain to me what investors are currently saying about how we're doing, and getting people to talk about what they know. And that gives you way more information to know, how should I I do my job effectively, to meet in the middle in terms of what's commercially and strategically required at this point in time. But also it helps build a relationship. This person's interested, okay, and then often it will come back and they'll be interested in you. And then I think when you work with finance colleagues and you're thinking about people-related interventions, you've got to have a business case. You shouldn't be able to walk into finance and, unlike the tech team, you can just go, oh, give me all this money to put this flexible working thing in. You've got to have an investment case. You've got to use your data. And sometimes the data we have isn't simple. It's quite longitudinal. You can't really necessarily see if it's correlated or if there's causation. But if you can't tell that from your own data inside your own organization, draw on wider studies, wider academic research, places where those links have been proven. And then I think for an HR professional, raw professional, you've got to put all that together and then do a bit of storytelling. And even finance professionals love a bit of storytelling. If you can put your data together with the story and then talk about it with enthusiasm and a bit of confidence, I think sometimes that's the magic recipe. I'm not sure that's answered your question. I've gone down a rabbit hole of thinking about my wonderful finance colleagues and how to get the best out of each other.
Yeah, it's all about, as we talked about, it's all about that relationship type thing. And I really liked what you were talking about when you were explaining how I want to be able to speak the language and what are investors saying, like, and that natural curiosity. We talk about that quite a lot at LACE. We've written a white paper, actually. It's called From Implementer to Influencer, HR's Role in Business Transformation. It's all around how does HR link what it wants to do to the business objectives, like to the objectives of the organization and ultimately the investors too, particularly when you're working within a PLC. We are almost out of time. I can't believe how quickly that's flown by. I've only asked you about half the questions that I wanted to ask you. So what I wanted to do is one final kind of wrap up question, really. And it's all, I want to get your take on the future of the way in which the function is going. So it's quite an open question, so I'm going to let you go in any direction that you want to, but where do you see the profession or the function of reward and performance going within the next, let's pick an arbitrary sort of year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? What sort of direction do you see it going?
I come back to the fact I'm an optimist. And I think that opportunities are for us now to help organizations perform and realize their potential and help the people within them realize their potential is just so huge. And I don't believe that AI is going to, I think AI will fundamentally change the ways in which we work, but I don't believe it's going to take all the jobs away. But we have to be able to change and adapt and to take a bit of risk in terms of how we use the technology. I think that this person, we've talked for years and years in Reward about how people have different expectations. They want a more personalized package. And that's been very difficult to achieve with the technology that's available to date. If you look even at using relative tools that exist today, large language models, their ability to cut through data and identify patterns and look for kind of correlations, I think that's so huge. That opens the door to being able to do that. I think, again, if you look at big things where you sit but with loads of data that to date has been very difficult to analyze, how people are claiming through a medical insurance plan and what interventions you can then take to proactively improve health and well-being. I think all these tools give us the opportunity to do this, even if you actually work in quite a small company where you don't have a huge team and the resources are more limited. So I'm very optimistic, but I do think it fundamentally changes. Companies are not going to need people to do the administering and turning the handle of some of the processes, which has been the core bread and butter of a lot of our work. That will increasingly, and I think probably with quite a lot of speed over the next few years, reduce significantly. It opens up this amazing other space we can operate in where we're much more strategic partners and helping drive the business's performance. But that takes also investing in our own skills and not just learning new things, but equally unlearning some of the old ways we had of doing it. I think we are all guilty, especially the longer you work, of thinking experience has taught us that we know the answers. And I think now more than ever, there's just everything might be different. So having an open mind, being curious, I think those are the most important things. And then transparency is going to increase. It's not going away. Focus on skills. So I think if you want to hone in on some of the more technical areas that I would really spend my time learning, I would learn how this technology all works and, how to use it well. And I would spend my time thinking about skills and transparency and those things.
Yeah, certainly. I think it's some of what you've been talking about there really resonates with me, and words that pop into my head are the ability to be as an individual more agile. This isn't specifically for reward, but just business professionals of the future, be more agile, be more adaptable, be more open to change. A lot of us are naturally creatures of habit, but you need to have that curious sort of mindset that we've talked about as well. Jenny, we're out of time today, which is, go on, sorry.
I was just going to say as my final thing, I do think maybe with a bit more realism to temper my optimism, we are going to have to, as HR professionals, continue to work very hard to have our seat at the table. I think that a lot of this technology will make it much, much easier for business leaders to self-serve, and building those real trusted relationships where you can advise, but also challenge is going to become even harder. You can imagine a business leader who likes what their AI companion tells them about how to manage their team better than the annoying HR person who's being challenging. So I think we will need to continue to innovate, improve, and earn our seat at the table by showing what we can add commercially and strategically and the value that we bring that is different to technology. But that won't necessarily always be an easy road. No. We've got to work hard.
Yeah, certainly. Do you know what's really interesting? Just popped into, just based on this conversation, we've talked a lot about how 40 years ago, it was a personnel department. Then it became a HR, human resources department. And there's been a big trend about becoming almost people departments. And I wonder the whole nature with AI and technology, whether or not the idea of moving back towards a human resources or human relations, that is the HR, maybe that is a way in which the evolution of the people function. That's just that's just a thought to leave everybody with as we wrap up today's podcast.
Yeah, and we may also be managing the tech. Yes. I'm interested to know, when will the first ER case where there's a complaint between the technology and a person, and it may be a case of the technology complaining about the person rather than the other way around. I don't think that's that futuristic and that far off, if I'm honest.
Yeah, a couple of little hot takes that we've dropped in there for you just as we end this podcast. But I hope you've enjoyed listening to this as much as I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it a lot, because that's what happens when I put a load of questions together and I only get through about 4 or 5 of them, because we go off on these really interesting and fascinating tangents. But Jenny, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. It's been marvellous having you on. If you would like to hear more of Jenny, why don't you get into contact with us? You can drop me a note. It's chris.howard@lacepartners.com, or connect with me on LinkedIn. Jenny, can they find you on LinkedIn if they want to connect? And do you want to just tell them where?
They can. I think that's jenny.craik, but maybe I'll give you the details, and then if anyone gets lost trying to find me, they can come by you.
We'll certainly put them in the show notes. It's been a really good pod, really enjoyed this one. We will certainly look to try and do more about this My Career in Reward. We might do more across some of our other functions as well. But from myself and from Jenny, thank you very much for listening. And hopefully we'll catch you next time on the People Agenda podcast. Bye-bye.